Hi, I'm Captain Chris. Welcome to By the Numbers. In this section, we're going to pretty much cover how to learn close combat at breakneck speed. This is a modified version of the exact same accelerated kinesthetic learning program I developed for the U.S. military and the New Jersey public school system, which today many still technical schools and high-level training schools are still using it. We're going to divide the section into basically, I'm going to give Chris a quick Captain Chris science corner on how the brain works. I'm going to talk to you a little bit how to use DVD and audio CDs to supercharge your learning. We're going to go into the actual skills and tools you're going to need to make By the Numbers work for you. And then finally, we're going to get into the actual By the Numbers method. When we get to this section, I'm going to actually teach you how to take proper notes because it's very, very important in that section alone. For this stuff right now, you really don't have to take any notes. Just sit back, relax, listen to me, and you'll pretty much remember it. So let's get going. We have a lot to cover. All right, first thing we're going to talk about is literally why is it so hard to learn martial arts in general. And close combat's a little different, which I'll get into in a second also because of the gross motor movements. But fighting in general is the ultimate neural blocker. Right? The way your brain works and the way you remember things is that you create what's called a series of neural paths. And many of you know this already, is that to think of an action, all right, here's the action, maybe it's something as simple as punching somebody, right? You first have to think of the action, which then triggers a neural pathway to the next neuron, which is disseminating that thinking information into some sort of muscle movement, which would be punching, okay? And so then this is the action, and then here is the actual technique thrown. Martial arts, or fighting in general, and why most complex motor movement-based arts, whether it's mixed martial arts or karate or jiu-jitsu or even judo, what happens is that by the time you generally think of this, you're getting hit, which means that you're afraid, or you don't want to get hit, or you're evading something. And so what happens is that there's an automatic neural break, and you never actually get to these last two things. And Muhammad Ali said it, you know, everybody has a plan until they get hit. And it's because of this exact neural blocker that happens. And this neural blocker goes along with everything that I usually teach, which is fear, all right, and how to combat fear. So as usual, the actual fear or anticipation of fear is the big enemy in this case. When we talk about the brain, without getting really too deep into it, right, everybody thinks we have one brain. Some people know that we have a left and a right hemisphere, but it really goes a little more than that. I'm not going to really break down the brain too much, but in reality we actually have three brains. We have the cognitive, right, which is the thinking brain, and that's divided up into a left and a right hemisphere. All right, and the right hemisphere takes care of creative and global thinking, and the left hemisphere takes care of linear and organized thinking. Right, so we have the cognitive brain. Then we have what's called the emotional brain. Right, and the emotional brain, well, takes care of emotion. Right, the two driving factors for your emotional brain are pain and pleasure, and I'll come right back to that in a minute. Because then at the bottom you have your what's called, some people call it the reptilian brain. Right, this is, if you look at evolution, this is really what was developed first, right, in lower classes of primates. Then the more advanced skill levels you get, emotional brain, and then too, humans have a cognitive brain. Advanced chimpanzees, gorillas, they have cognitive brains also, which is why they can learn things like sign language and to perform tasks. Dogs, another mammal that stops pretty much an emotional brain. While dogs are very smart and very loyal, the reason is because they're all driven by pain or pleasure. They never actually go through, which is why if you watch that movie, Something About Mary, when Ben Stiller throws the treat out the window, the dog goes after it because he's only looking for the pleasure. He's not even thinking about what could happen if he jumps out the window. All right, so what happens when, also if you notice, this looks a lot like I just showed you with the neural pathway because it's basically the same thing. So what happens is when you are fighting or you are put into a fear-induced situation is that automatically just natural body chemistry is that your body wants to shut this entire section off, right? And only go back to your reptilian brain, because reptilian is what controls your fight or flight mechanism, right? What triggers this completely bypasses the cognitive and goes to your pain or pleasure sensor in your emotional brain. So high-level fighters, right? Mixed martial artists and ultimate fighting, Olympic judo players, Brazilian Pan Am game, Brazilian jiu-jitsu guys, whatever. They know that they're never going to be killed in the ring. So they never even have to worry about this, right? And in other sections in the first accelerated battlefield combative, the close combat training, I talk about the elevated fear-induced heart rate of that when you go above 145 beats per minute, and that's when your complex motor movements, which is, again, anything that involves two muscle groups or more in a complex sequence of events, all right, starts to deteriorate. And then once you get 175 beats per minute, boom, fight or flight kicks in, and you cannot do this, all right? This is the trigger right here, all right? And again, your emotional brain only knows pain or pleasure. So it doesn't really... it's not able to readily determine, because it's not thinking of, is this thing going to actually kill me? Is this thing going to harm me? Is this thing going to, or is it something beneficial? So it's basically, it's a reaction-based system, your emotional brain. And so high-level fighters, what they do is when they're training, they're not only training to control their heart rate, so they're not put into a fear-induced, and that they stay in between 115 and 145 beats per minute, because that's the optimal heartbeat frame for complex motor movements. An optimal here for you, right? But by doing this, by constantly training, constantly beating themselves up, constantly putting themselves into that situation of training over and over and over, right? They're able to completely, basically shut off their emotional brain and then actually think through the problem. And let me erase this for a minute. And that actual process is what a term that many of you are actually already familiar with, which is called muscle memory. Now, truth of the matter is there's no such thing as muscle memory. Your muscles don't have brains. They can't remember. What muscle memory is doing is that it is your emotional brain is now shut off, all right? Which means that access to your reptilian brain, which controls, again, your autonomic nervous system and your fight or flight mechanism, that's not even in the picture. But muscle memory shuts off your emotional brain and lets you think through a problem. Not necessarily thinking of taking the time, but the neural pathway from thinking, which we talked about before, thinking to action, right, to actually what happens, okay, is literally a greased water slide. All right, you just go right down it because you've done it so many times. You're not, if here is your cognitive brain, all right, your left and your right hemisphere, whole brain thinking is activated, which means that it crosses over the barrier, and organizational and creative recalls the movement. So this thinking becomes very automatic. It goes right down the slide to making it happen. All right, you don't have to necessarily think about the action because the neural pathway is so deep, it's so forged. It's very similar to making a new path in the woods. If the first time you're looking for something, you might not know where you're going. By the time you get there, there's really no path behind you. But if you go there over and over and over again, it forms a very deep path with no trees or bushes or rocks in the way, and it's very, very clean, and you're able to do it. This is the problem. Just like a path in the woods is if you don't use the path enough, is that it starts growing, gets overgrown, rocks get in the way, animals trample over it. And just like this, if you do not use and practice to keep this muscle memory, right, going, this path fades, all right, and little nicks start going in there, all right, and the path doesn't become as strong. Now, sometimes this is great. If you are a very, very competitive athlete or martial artist, if you have basics, all right, those basics, it's very important that the basics, that neural pathway is always clean and clear. When you learn new skills, what happens, new advanced skills, is that they dovetail off of the basics. So the basics are always there. For general people, and this is also including soldiers and police officers who are not in harm's way every single day, even they're in it in different stints, is that it's very important to keep these pathways clean. But if you're not training your hardest every single day, it's very, very difficult, which is what this is all about. So let's talk about how to make this work without beating yourself up, without training every single day, and without really having to do as much work as is necessary, which is the whole point of accelerated kinesthetic, which is movement learning. All right, in this section we're going to start covering how to use the materials I've sent you to supercharge your learning. When we talk about actual accelerated learning, it's very important to know that there are different learning styles, and everybody learns differently, and everybody kind of knows this. And in the last 10 years in educational system, both military training and public school system, this has really become prevalent thanks to the work of Howard Gardner and the Harvard School of Education. He's really done some great work with this. But reality is that everybody either learns visually, let me get the marker, some stinks, auditorily, which means hearing, or kinesthetically, which we've been talking about, which means movement. And to make it even worse, visually, is that it's very rare to find a pure visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learner, and that everybody is a little bit in between two or more of them, which gets really complicated in the modern school system because it's still run like it was in the 18th century when it was developed for factory workers and the Industrial Revolution and whatnot. So in today's modern classroom, for teachers who are actually doing accelerated learning techniques, is their job is to activate the different types of learning styles. And to make it even more complex, there's actually even goes into the theory of multiple intelligences, which is about 8 or 9 broken down in between each one of those main 3. But for purposes of learning movement, what we're really interested in is obviously kinesthetic learning skills. Kinesthetic learning skills are very, very difficult to learn. We already just covered to forge those neural pathways, you have to do it over and over and over and over again. Even simple movements and even gross motor movements, if they're not taught properly or explained properly, then the person is not going to remember them. And for somebody not to remember a gross motor movement, which again is just a simple one major muscle group, very clean movement, whether it's raising your arm above your head, or moving it across your body, or lifting your leg off the ground to run, or to push away, right? These are all single action gross motor movements. For somebody not to remember those is a very big deal. And it's the same reason why when little kids are taught sports, if they're not taught the gross motor movements first, then it's very difficult to pick up the complex and fine motor movements of a sport. So what's great about close combat is that, yes, close combat techniques are mostly gross motor movement based, about 90% of them. But what's great for all you who are already martial artists or already have some other training is that this is going to bring you back to the beginning, all right? The stuff that you wish you learned when you first started training, because this is going to make your core and basic skills, which we just talked about also, all right, that much stronger. So if I draw that illustration again, if here becomes your new core skills, right, by using this by the numbers accelerated kinesthetic learning techniques I'm about to show you, all right, it will replace, here's your old core skills, all right. I'm not saying that they're bad or wrong, I'm just saying that these are better, all right, and for obvious reasons. If these are your old skills, all right, this neural pathway doesn't necessarily go away. What it does, all right, we talked about holes just appearing. If we replace that with gross motor movement, clean neural pathway, right, based on whether you're a visual, auditory, or kinesthetic learner, this takes precedence over this, and this will eventually fade out. Now, what won't fade out are your advanced skills, all right? So say you are a judo player, or a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu stylist, or a Muay Thai boxer, right? It doesn't really matter, right? Your advanced skills now are based on core competencies of gross motor close combat skills, which transfer it over to everything else. So basically what that means is that all your advanced skills now have a much, much, much stronger core base, which means that if you are tired, injured, half dead, okay, starving, freezing cold, all right, burning hot, is that, and you can't, all right, because of those fear-induced heart rate problems that we just talked about that causes those breaks in these neural pathways, is that your strong core of close combat gross motor skills is still there, which, believe it or not, can fix these holes, okay? So if you are, not that you are going to be in a threatening situation tomorrow, but if you are a very, very good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu player, okay, very good, and you are surprised, all right, you're completely, knocked off guard, you wind up on the ground, you know that you have to get the guy in the guard, then you need to swivel around to sweep him over so you're in a mounted position, all right? Well, that's all a lot to think about. And when we talked about your three brains before, if this guy has a knife or anything, even if you're surprised, that fear-induced is going to knock holes in here. But because you have now followed this course and have a good close combat core and a strong neural pathway that really can't be erased because these are gross motor movements and because of the way you were going to learn, is that you will be able to reforge this path in the middle of battle. And now this is very, very important for police and soldiers, because for them, in the middle of battle means reloading their weapon, getting their hands on something, but even for the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy or common person, even if you don't have the advanced skills, having that clean, neural, non-fading pathway is very, very important. And the way to do that is through programs like Close Combat, right? DVDs, right? Audio CDs or tapes or whatever, audio CDs, okay? Multimedia, right, which can be everything from interactive experiences to reading manuals and booklets. And if you notice, this is why we pretty much incorporate all this, as many different methods and multimedia educational tools as we can, because everybody learns differently, right? Some people like to read the manuals more than watch the DVDs, okay? Audio CDs are very, very difficult for close combat and fighting, because you can't tell somebody auditorily how to do something in a physical task, but it does sometimes reinforce basic skills. So as we move on to advanced levels, you will see that there are some auditory and audio CDs that are available. We have lots of downloads, and we provide as much material as possible to incorporate your learning style so you get the most out of it. All right, that's step one. When you are learning from multimedia, right, audio CDs, right, or tapes or downloads or MP3s or whatever, are great because they are passive learning tools, all right? Which means that, unlike a DVD or a manual, you don't have to sit still and watch or read it, okay? You can turn your car into a mobile university, right? pop that CD in, pop that whatever in, your MP3 player, whatever, and listen to this as you're going. I sometimes will play learning CDs with content that I'm interested in learning at the time while I'm getting dressed or while I'm doing other things, because even if you're not necessarily paying attention to it, the passive action of auditory learning, right, if we go back to our cognitive, emotional, and reptilian brain, right, passively, right, it doesn't have to go through the emotional and reptilian check to see if your cognitive brain accepts it. Reality is that unless you are sitting in a lecture hall, which, by the way, is the absolute worst way to teach, of just somebody up there and with a room full of people and no interaction whatsoever, it's not the greatest. If you're doing it passively, which is, you can even strip the audio from here, we might actually do that for you, it eliminates this box over here and lets you jump right into your right and left whole brain thinking. So it permeates your subconscious. You might have to listen to it a couple times, right? But because you do not have to necessarily pay strict attention to it, it sometimes will actually get in there in your brain a little deeper. Now, this is a problem, obviously, when we're talking about fighting skills, because like I just said, you have to actually see them to use them, correct? So, which brings us to the next part, which is DVDs, right, or video, or MPEGs, or whatever format we're watching it in these days, right? Visual learning is obviously when you're looking at something, and visual learners, pure visual learners, are almost completely left brain based, and they're very far and few between, just the same as kinesthetic learners are generally right brain based, and it's very, very difficult to then bridge out to other types of learning. But pure visual learners are the people in school that can look at a book read that chapter or that page once, right, or look what the teacher's drawing on the board and just know it. It automatically, because they saw it, it actually goes right into their brain. They're able to literally regurgitate it. In the public school system, this is great, and this is why they do great on tests, because all they're doing is transferring that knowledge that they saw back onto another visual medium, which is writing on a test or a paper. Now, if you ask them to explain it or to put it in action, that's a whole other ball of wax, which is the reason why people who do fantastic in school don't necessarily make it out in the real world, because they're not able to apply that information. But on the other end, kinesthetic learners who are able to do things by movement, okay, and they're almost completely right brain based, which is creative global pictures of putting things in action. They're horrible in school. They can't sit still. Tests are, they don't remember what's drawn on the board. They need complete interaction. They need to get up and do it, and they're very good at demonstrating it. Tests, not so much. Again, when you get out in the real world, these girls become professional athletes or entrepreneurs or business leaders because they have a global vision. It's not that one is necessarily better than the other, because both are needed for success in all fields. It's just that it's very important for you to know that you have to be somewhere, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, right? You have to be somewhere in the middle, right? And you have to, if you are purely kinesthetic or purely visual, everybody's a little bit auditory, but you have to forcefully make yourself do things that you wouldn't necessarily do. If you don't necessarily like to read, well, guess what? Everything comes at a price, all right? I'm not telling you that you're going to have to read a manual word for word, all right? And if you are kinesthetic, all right, you would want to get up and do things, but you have to kind of step out of your comfort zone a little, especially with the methods I'm about to tell you. But before we get into that, DVDs are really, really, really powerful, all right? Video in general is powerful, and one of the biggest, I guess, criticism that people give is like, how can you possibly learn from video? How could you not learn if somebody is standing there next to you teaching you the exact what you're supposed to do? And the reality is that by watching a video, it covers a lot of different bases, is that number one, you are seeing generally perfect technique, perfect teaching, a perfect method. Okay? And the truth of the matter is that, sure, you can go into any martial arts school or any other learning environment and learn something one-on-one with somebody, but there's no guarantee that they're going to be the perfect model to follow. So if you are not following the perfect model, well then how can you be perfect at what you're doing, right? Even if if you're following an imperfect model and you're even half as good, well, that means you're half as good as something imperfect, right? At least if you're half as good as something perfect, then you're halfway there.